Chapter 28. Tower of London. Wednesday the 6th of June, 2463. These Christian bacilli must be crushed before they infect the planet. General Felix Ray, addressing the new United Nations. February 2289. Lal turned over and lay spread-eagled naked across the bed, heart-thumping, blood-pulsing, gasping at the dim patterns on the ceiling. After some moments, he looked across at Maria, also lying naked on her back beside him and panting. In the moonlight he could see that her neck and shoulders were flushed, her cheeks red. She turned to face him, her fingers intertwining with his, and they stared into each other's eyes, neither one saying a word. As his heartbeat slowed down, he drifted off to sleep, a kaleidoscope of colours swirling behind his eyelids. He awoke to find her sitting at the side of the bed. She turned and smiled softly, stroked his arm and whispered huskily, "My amazing Dr. Lal." He pulled her hand to his lips and kissed it. "Just going to the bathroom." She stood up and let her hand trail out from his. Silhouetted before the leaded windows, she tossed her hair free, the moonlight throwing patterns across her body. He knew instinctively that this was a moment he must capture and remember, the narrowness of her waist, the tilt of her neat breasts, the graceful line of her back. She looked out of the window and then padded barefoot out of the room. Lost in his thoughts and drifting into sleep, Lal did not immediately hear the commotion outside. It was only when there was a fearful scream down the corridor, punctuated by a couple of shots, that he sat up. It had been Robert's voice, and now there were more rough shouts and heavy footsteps crashing on the bare floorboards. Maria ran into the bedroom, dragged him out of bed, bundled up their clothes and shoes, switched off the lights, and pulled him into the living room. They hid behind the sofa. Moments later, a shoulder splintered the lock of the oak door, and two men barged into the lounge. He caught a glimpse of them as they rushed into the bedroom. Both were dressed head to foot in black. Both had handguns, and one was bearded. "Dr. Lal!" snarled the first. They turned the lights on and made a cursory search of the bedroom. Lal heard one say to the other in Hindi, "Not here." They left, and he heard boots running down the corridor. Maria, crouching naked next to him, turned and whispered, "We've got to get out of here." He needed no further persuading. "Let's go." "Get dressed then," she urged. "If he can't come back, these people won't stop until they've got the data spheres and killed you. Where are they?" Tower of London." "The Tower of London?" She gave a gasp of exasperation. They threw on their clothes. "Do you need keys?" He was baffled. "Keys? What for?" "To get into this tower, of course." No, we don't." "Good, now take this." She passed to him her bag. "How do we get to the horses?" He thought for a moment. "No, boat. Best way is by boat." "By boat?" But after a moment's hesitation she said, "Better still. Which way?" "To the terrace." On the floor above they heard crashes and the barking of orders. Several more shots rang out. Gingerly, Lal opened the door and saw a body sprawled in the unlit corridor. He guessed it was Robert and was about to go over to him when she grabbed him. "No, it's too late. No one can help him now. We've got to get up or you'll end up like that." They scurried down the passageway. Somewhere behind them there were further shouts and the slamming of doors. In the dark, they darted down a staircase and opened a door onto the terrace, each time glancing around corners to make sure the way ahead was clear. They heard a man screaming for his life. It was Miguel. 2 shots rang out. Miguel was silenced. Lal was not religious, but at that moment he uttered aloud an urgent prayer. "God, look after Bee and Guppy." They scampered along the terrace. The image flashed in his mind that barely 3 hours ago they were finishing a civilized dinner here. Lal took 6 steps to the jetty in one leap. He turned around and stretched out his hand. "Pass me your bag." He then took her hand. "Take care." In the moonlight, 4 boats lay bobbing and slopping in the black waters. "Which one?" "This one." He stepped in, steadying himself. "Your hand." He helped her into the boat. "Sit there," he pointed. "Stow your bag under the seat. You must take care of the tiller." "The what?" "You steer the boat." He unfastened the rope from the jetty and pushed off, cursing as he fumbled to lock the oars, the sound of wood clunking against wood in the silent night air. "Lal, they're here." He looked up to see 2 flashlights weaving at the far end of the terrace. He cut his oars into the water and leaned back, pulled hard. He must have made a dozen frantic strokes before the splashes betrayed them. A beam of light swept the river and caught the boat. "They've seen us," she cried, but he didn't answer. Already he must have made nearly 70 meters of distance, and with each stroke he added more. There were shouts, several shots cracked, but already they were disappearing into the darkness under the arches of Westminster Bridge. Lal raised his oars and let the boat glide for a few seconds, heaving for breath. Now that they were through the arches, he could see the 2 flashlights had been joined by a further 3. "There are 5 of them," he said flatly, staring back at the austere silhouette of the Houses of Parliament. The thought passed through his mind, "Will I ever see this place again?" "What do you think they'll do?" He resumed rowing, this time with slower, more deliberate strokes. "I expect they'll come after us." "5 of them. They'll catch us." "Not in those tubs, they won't. This one's the lightest and fastest. If we maintain a steady pace, we can easily outrun them. And I know how to navigate through these collapsed bridges. They don't." As they approached the bend in the river at Waterloo Bridge, he glanced over his shoulder. "Steer starboard. To the right, towards the bank." "To the right," said Maria. "The only navigable channel is there. You'll feel the current pick up. Just keep her steady as we pass under." As they neared the span, Lal withdrew the oars and turned around, kneeling on the board, ready to use them to push the boat away from the bridge. The boat drifted faster, and the sound of the river altered as they swirled beneath it. "Good," he said with relief, as they emerged the other side. "Have we a torch in the boat?" asked Maria. "No, but even if we had, I wouldn't use it. Give our position away. I know my way and moonlight is enough." As they slid away from the bridge, Lal saw pinpricks of light on the river. "There they are. Must be 300-400 meters away." Maria twisted round. "They're only a few minutes behind us then." He raised the oars, allowing the boat to drift and to give himself a minute to get his wind back. "We're fine. They'll struggle to clear the snags at Waterloo Bridge." It was a clear and cool night, but despite this he could feel the sweat under his armpits and his shirt clinging to his back. A mist hung on the face of the river. He could make out his position from the sheen of the gaunt black buildings and empty towers lining either bank like silent sentries. He resumed pulling, this time at a more leisurely 7 or 8 strokes per minute. They continued downstream, negotiating their way beneath a series of ruined bridges, the only sounds being those of his oars and a pack of feral dogs on the north bank baying at a pack on the south. "After we recover the dataspheres," said Maria, "where do we go?" "I've been thinking about that. There are 2 possibilities. Firstly, we could sit it out in the tower until daylight and then look for guards. Otherwise, we could continue rowing downstream. There's a fishing village some clicks eastward, called Tilbury. We could summon help there." "Don't underestimate these people," said Maria. "They're very committed and very resourceful." "Don't worry," he forced a laugh. "I believe you." He wondered who else might have been killed. James? Guppy? He reflected that the handful of troopers guarding the palace must certainly be dead too, but he was sure the alarm would have been raised by now, and other guards would soon be out searching for them. She leaned forward and gave his knee a squeeze. Well done, Dr. Lal. My lover has turned out to be an unlikely man of action. Thanks for the compliment. He knew he did not have the luxury to mourn those who had been murdered. They had to get the dataspheres and survive. He couldn't afford to dwell on what-ifs right now. He had to be in the present. Looking at his watch, he saw that it was past 3 in the morning. Past 3. He was surprised by his own energy. He ought to be feeling exhausted, and yet he felt alert, although his arms ached and his hands were raw from the oars. We're now coming to a hazardous part of the river. You should be able to see the tower on your left-hand side. Those 2 towers? Lal glanced around, lifting his oars so that they skimmed the water. No, they're the remnants of Tower Bridge. He resumed rowing. We must steer away from the right bank. Somewhere around here are the remains of a sunken battleship. More than a few watermen have been holed by it in daytime, let alone at night. Okay. Heading for the left bank. Good. You should see the tower with its walls. I do, she replied. Now where? Head for Traitor's Gate. Traitor's what? Traitor's Gate. It's the river entrance. Call that because in the old days when traitors were brought down river by boat, that's where they would go in, and if they were executed, their heads would be stuck up on the old London Bridge. The outer walls and turrets of the tower loomed closer as he struggled to bring the boat in. Twice they drifted past the castellated entrance. Twice he had to row back. Eventually he negotiated the boat into the river gate. In the blackness, he heard the keel grind on the bottom. He got out and immediately sank up to his calves in mud, lost his balance and toppled backwards. Are you all right? He was angry. Appearances were important to him, and he was sitting in cold mud, feeling ridiculous. Yes and no. He got up and wiped his hands on his trousers. You stay there and throw me the rope. He could see her silhouetted against the Thames. She cast the rope, and he hauled the boat out of the mud and onto the shingle. He lifted her with her bag and carried her to where the ground was firm underfoot. As he put her down, she placed her arms behind his neck and pulled him down. They kissed. Breaking away, he said, Now, I need to light a match to find our way out of here. Rummaging in his pockets, he pulled out a box of matches. Thankfully, they were still dry. The light showed a flight of stone steps among the nettles and washed-up wood. This way, he said, dropping the match before it burnt his fingers. Once at the top, Lal took some moments to get his bearings. They were now inside the curtain walls, and he saw the turrets of the White Tower gleaming in the moonlight. When you see it in the daylight, it looks like the castle from a fairy tale, Sleeping Beauty. Only our sleepers aren't beauties. What do you mean? The White Tower is one giant ossuary, a charnel house, one of my pet projects. All the bones we've collected in this part of London have been stored there, tens of thousands of them. Oh. He noticed a reticence in her voice. That's why I told you the case was safe. Most of these people are so stupidly superstitious that few would ever dare to prowl around this place in the day, let alone at night. That applied to him as well. He was quite happy to be in the White Tower in daytime, in the company of others. However, as dusk fell, he sometimes felt a brooding presence, and always was glad to leave the place. But this was not a time to be faint-hearted. He took her arm. Come on, let's go. He felt her freeze. Tens of thousands of skeletons, you say? Was she going to have another one of those turns, like at the Parapluie Centre? He couldn't handle histrionics at this moment, not with a boatload of armed killers out on the river somewhere. Look, he said firmly, it'll be one of the great sights of London someday. It's quite spectacular, even beautiful. Please, don't worry, I'm here with you. He gripped her arm. Now, this way. He had to light 6 more matches to find the path through the trees to reach the base of the White Tower. "Where's the door?" she asked. "Up there." She looked up and could make out a porch framed by creepers and lichens, some 3 or 4 meters above the ground. "How do we get up there? Climb?" "No, there should be a ladder lying around here somewhere." Lighting a 7th match, he kicked about in the undergrowth. "Here it is." He picked it up and cursed. "Burn yourself." "No." He was sucking his hand. "Got nicked by a damned thorn." He leaned it against the wall. "What a crazy place for your front door." "Not if you're being besieged by a medieval army, it isn't. Normally a wooden staircase would have been here. Now, you go first while I hold the ladder." He followed her up, carrying her bag. There he lit another match, cupping the flame. "There should be some lanterns and tools just to our right." He stooped down. "Here they are." He passed her the battery lantern and took a flashlight for himself. "Don't switch it on until we're round the corner." He switched his on when he was on a winding stone staircase, its steps worn from centuries of use. Once on the next level, Maria switched on her lantern from low power to high. It illuminated the great hall, a chamber as wide and as deep as the White Tower itself. Disturbed pigeons cooed and fluttered in the niches of the roof. "My God!" she gasped in horror, grabbing him. The first impression was of a massive mosaic in shades of brown, until it became clear that every square centimetre of the walls, columns, arches and ceiling were inlaid with human bones. They were set in intricate geometric patterns of femurs, skulls, leg bones, arm bones, vertebrae. She stared, open-mouthed. "It's hideous." "No," he said. "This is art. For 6 years I've been paying 8 sculptors to create this, and it's not yet finished." The beam of his flashlight followed up a column and swept the roof, where pelvic bones fanned out in swirling patterns. He traced down to one of the huge chandeliers made from twisting chains of vertebrae and interlocking rib cages. "Someday, this'll be one of the greatest attractions on the earth." He shone his beam around the floor. Along the sides of the chamber stood suits of armour, arrays of pikes, swords, muskets, and rapiers. "Come on, follow me." They entered a doorway into another winding staircase. As they climbed, he thought better than to tell her that the bones of the 2 little princes, probably murdered by their uncle Richard III, were discovered under one of these steps. At the top, they entered a large room with stout Romanesque arches with an apse above. Neatly stacked from floor to ceiling were bones, different types, different sizes, all arranged in separate sections. "This is St. John's Chapel. It's said to be the oldest church in London. William the Conqueror would have prayed here. Today it's a storeroom." "Oh no." Maria was smothering her mouth with the palm. "It stinks." She began to retch. Putting down her lantern, she went to a corner, knelt down and began to puke up. He bit his lip and looked away, waiting for her to finish. Great. That was dinner, he reflected. Truffle soup, a game table, water ices, and a very expensive pineapple. The chapel did have an old musty smell, but not one so overpowering that he ever felt sick. Finally she groaned. From his pocket he passed her his red silk handkerchief. "Here, use this." In the anemic light of the lantern she looked grey. "Thanks." She wiped her mouth. "Do you want me to take you outside?" She shook her head to clear it. "No, I'll be fine. Let's just find what we came here for and get out." For the first time, the thought came into his mind. How on earth did I get involved in all this? People were trying to kill him. He was muddy, his wet trousers chafed the inside of his thighs, and his buttocks were cold. "It's under the altar." "What is?" she asked, but he was already taking a handful of bones off a pile and placing them on the floor. Soon, disassembled bones were lying scattered on the floor. "Here we are," he grunted. dragging out a wooden chest. He got down on his haunches. Who'd dream of searching for anything in here? He flipped open the catch and lifted the lid and pulled out a bundle of rags. With both hands, he next brought out a plastic tube. Thank heavens for Andy. Here's one. Careful, it's heavy, he said, handing it to her. Put it in your bag. He produced the second. And here's the other. Good. And what about the skull? Just a moment, he replied, noting the edge in her voice. He pulled out more rags. His fingers felt the shape of a skull wrapped in a cloth. This must be it. There was a scuffling of footsteps on the staircase. A man's voice called out. Here! Shouted Maria. Lal's chin fell, and he looked up at her in shock. His surprise was doubled when into the dim light of the chapel entered both of the men who had broken into her suite. He searched the faces hard, but he was sure he had not made a mistake. Both held handguns. He could only stammer, "What's going on?" "Pass me my skull, please," she answered firmly. He blinked, his confused eyes darting from her to the two burly thugs standing by her. "Maria," he pleaded, "tell me what's going on." "Lal," she commanded, "give it to me, now." Clutching the skull to his chest, he blurted, "Not until you tell me." "I'm sorry. I didn't want it to be this way, but you know too much." He stood up slowly, shaking his head in disbelief. "Yes. Now give me my skull." His mind was churning. How could this be the same woman he had made love to earlier? "Your skull? Why is it yours?" "Lal," she sighed. "Lal," as if talking to a child. "I'm not Maria." "Not Maria?" His face was one of complete incomprehension. Then who the hell are you?" "I'm the man whose skull that is." He gagged. He stood speechless. This was unfathomable. "That's right. And the skull belongs to me, Sanjay Dutt." "You?" He let the cloth slip off to reveal the stained cranium and the vacant eye sockets. He looked at the skull, and then at her. Me. She too was staring at it intently. "I've had to live in different bodies all these centuries, with my memories and consciousness mixed up with other people. The original me is in there. In here." He turned the skull over and frowned. The suggestion was fantastical. "Yes, you can't believe how much I've longed for it, craved for it. 1,000 times, no, 10,000 times worse than yearning for a long-lost twin. I've been incomplete, like a wandering lost soul. At last I'm going to be reunited with myself, be me again." Lal felt the ground beneath him go soggy. He wondered if he was going to faint. "If you had gone along with me," she continued, "then maybe things could have been different. I like you, I genuinely do. But you know too much. I'm sorry." "Sorry?" "Yes, sorry." She turned to the thug on her left, who took a step towards Lal. "Hold it!" A voice rang out of the darkness. "Put your hands above your heads." The command was deliberate and clear. It was Andy. Two men raised their hands. "Drop your guns!" the voice commanded. Maria screamed something in Hindi, and one of the two spun around. Andy fired, knocking him off his feet and sending him sprawling into a stack of bones which tumbled around him. A heartbeat later, the second made a dash to escape and was instantly felled by another 3 dry cracks. Into the light emerged Andy, with a petrified bee following him. "You okay, Doctor?" "Think so." "You," he snarled at Maria. "I said hands up." She complied. Seems we arrived in the nick of time. Keeping his gun trained on her, he glanced over at the two he had just shot. The bearded one was moaning lowly, writhing among some bones, and Andy dispatched him with 2 further shots. The second was lying open-mouthed, staring blankly at the roof, a growing puddle of blood seeping from the back of his head. He moved towards Maria. Now who the fuck is she? Or is it he? He pressed his handgun hard against her cheek. We'll find out soon enough, my little darling. Bee scurried over and put her arms around Lyle. He was still in a state of confusion and bewilderment. Your other mates are dead at the bottom of the ladder, spat out Andy, as he leered into Maria's face. I killed them. He jabbed the muzzle under her chin, while her eyes glowed with rage and defiance. Maria, you're not really Sanjay Dutt, are you? Asked Lal in a pained voice. She's no journalist, and she's not Maria Pallinson either, said Bee. She went over to her. Who are you? She asked calmly. Who the hell are you? To both Lal's and Andy's astonishment, she slapped Maria both ways across her cheeks. She doubled over, holding her face. Stop it! Cried Lal. Andy motioned to restrain her, but at that moment Maria reached into her bag, sprang up and grabbing Bee's hair pulled her close. In her hand she had a handgun and held it hard against Bee's temple. Get away! She shrieked. Get away or I'll kill the bitch! She fired wildly towards Andy. The shot ricocheted off the floor. Andy sprang behind a stack of bones. Give me my skull! Give me my skull now! Lal hesitated. Give me my skull! She screamed again, or I'll kill this one! Viciously, she yanked Bee's hair. Her head jerked back and she squealed in terror. Okay, said Lal, trying to pacify her. Don't hurt her. You can have your skull. In the bag. Put it in the bag. Warily, Lal complied. Now tell your bodyguard to come out with his hands up. No fucking way, shouted Andy from behind the stacks. Order him or I'll kill her. I'll kill her and I'll kill you. Tell him, she screamed. Maria, reassured Lal. No one will hurt you so long as you don't hurt Bee. His legs were trembling, but he was trying hard to read every snarl on her face, every twitch of her body. Andy won't do anything if you don't do anything to Bee. Andy, do you hear? There was silence. Andy, do you hear? He repeated louder. Yes, Doctor. Here. I'll put your skull in your bag. Okay? There. You've got your skull. Release Bee and you can go. Maria backed herself to where one of the dead thugs lay. Put those guns in the bag. A kick sent the handgun skidding across the floor towards him. My finger is on the trigger, she hissed, tugging at Bee's hair again. Pick it up by the barrel, she ordered. He did so. Now, in the bag. He put the gun into her bag. Now the other. He moved towards the other dead man. Slowly. He repeated the procedure. Now tell your man to throw out his gun. No way, roared Andy. No fucking way. Lal next felt as though a mule had kicked him and saw a flash as his head hit the stone floor. It took him several seconds of staring at 2 pairs of legs to realize that he had been shot. In his shock, he could see Maria's twisted face screaming at him and Bee's look of horror, but was deaf to the sounds. Then a pain surged up his body and the noise came flooding back. Tell your man to throw his gun out or you'll be dead, was overlaid by a faraway Andy yelling, You okay, Doctor? Lal sensed that what he did next would either cost or save both his life and Bee's. It focused down to that certainty. Hundreds of skulls stared back at him, each willing him to choose correctly. "Andy," he gasped, "give her your gun. We want no trouble. We're in a heap of fucking trouble already." Lal shouted as best he could over Maria's screaming and Bee crying, "Andy, trust me, throw out your gun." Seconds later, a handgun clattered onto the stone floor. "Put it in the bag!" shouted Maria. "I can't," he gasped, clutching his thigh. Maria snapped Bee's head back. She gave a squeal. "Move, bitch!" They both edged to where the gun lay. "Get down!" Awkwardly, they crouched down together. Maria stretched and placed the gun in her bag. "Up!" Maria's eyes darted about the chapel. She glared at Lal. "Throw me your flashlight!" He stretched his bloody hand to where his flashlight had dropped and rolled it to her. She stamped on it twice, crushing it. "Bag! Lantern!" she bucked. "Pick some up!" Once again they reenacted their bizarre minuet. When a whimpering Bee had the lantern and bag in her hands, Maria shuffled with her slowly towards the door. "Move, and the bitch dies!" The light began to fade as they withdrew from the chapel. Maria's last words to Lal were, "If you think your wife and kids were really killed by kidnappers, then you're a bigger fool than I think you are." The gun cracked again, a wild parting shot, and Lal gave out a gasp. Bee let out a wail of despair. He had been hit again, this time in the hip, and was writhing on the floor, grunting with pain. "You okay, Doctor?" asked Andy urgently. He had slipped out from the stacks of skeletons. "You okay?" But Lal could only gasp and groan. Bee was sobbing as Maria hauled her down the spiral staircase. "Shut up!" she snarled into her ear, "or I'll shoot you on these steps." Her mind was racing to formulate a plan. She'd kill the bitch who had slapped her at the top of the ladder, and then race down it before Andy could catch her. She'd push it over, and then make for the boat. As they edged along the great hall, she tried to slam Bee's head against the stone corner. At that moment, Bee found heart. Instinctively, she ducked and swung the lantern hard into Maria's face. Maria cried out, let slip her grip, but fired a shot, grazing Bee's ear. The lantern crashed onto the floor. All was blackness. "Bee!" shouted Lal from the floor above. Andy was already halfway down the staircase. In his hand, he was armed with a femur and his own flashlight, which was switched off. Maria scrabbled blindly in the dark, frantically trying to get away. Her head banged against something solid. She crawled around it, hoping it was hard enough to stop a shot. "You all right, love?" Andy's voice echoed in the wide chamber. 2 more shots sounded in the darkness. The roosting birds squawked and fluttered. She held her breath, hoping Maria could not hear her panting or her heart thumping. "Don't worry, I'll get her," called out Andy again. Bee wanted to scream out to him, but stayed silent. He pulled out his flashlight and for half a second swung it around the chamber. He saw Maria 10 meters away and ducked. She turned and fired 3 shots wildly in his direction. Andy threw the bone at where she had been and sprang into the hall, landing in a half-roll, a 4th shot spitting stone fragments into his face. Too close, he reckoned. How many shots might she have left? 20 at least. But he knew this hall. She didn't. He listened. No footsteps. She was listening too. She must be scared, lost in the dark, 1 against 2, handgun versus flashlight. From his crouching position, he made 2 leaps further into the hall. Another wild shot went off. He put his hand out. It felt something. It was one of the pillars. He slid around it, his fingers running down its side. They felt something round. They explored it. A skull. He pushed them through the eye sockets and jerked at it 3 or 4 times before it broke off the wall, loosening other bones which came clattering down. 2 more shots fired blindly at the sound. He smiled to himself. Panicky. His confidence was growing. He stretched out his hand and quickly swept the hall with his beam. She was standing in the middle, her gun arm extended, a ferocious expression on her face. She swung towards the light. Andy ducked again. 2 shots hit the pillar. He threw the skull with full force in her direction. He heard her cry out and switched on his flashlight a half-second. She was smarting, but nevertheless got off another shot in his direction. Andy moved position, 6 paces deeper into the great hall, knocking into something metallic which crashed over. Another shot. He was going to draw her to him. B was on all fours on the other side of the hall to Andy. His presence gave her hope. She had seen Maria for a split second when Andy had flashed his torch. She needed to get away. She started to crawl when Maria heard her and fired 2 shots in her direction. B cried out, leapt up, and ran headfirst into a wall. There was a clatter of wood and metal. Another shot smacked into the wall above her head. Her nose was bleeding, and she was sobbing. "B!" called out Andy. "You all right?" He switched his flashlight on and off to distract Maria. Momentarily stunned, B was stumbling and crawling among what she initially assumed were broom handles. Then her fingertips touched iron. She felt an edge. It was sharp. Her hands ran down the handle. It was long. She had run into a row of poleaxes and halberds leaning against the wall. She gripped one. It was a weapon. It gave her courage. Meanwhile, Andy was retreating further back into the great hall, in turn calling out to B to remain calm and goading Maria, changing position, flashing his torch on and off and throwing bones in her direction. Maria was disorientated. She knew she did not have unlimited rounds of ammunition, yet she had 3 further handguns in her bag. Andy was her main threat. The bitch could wait. 1 lucky shot, that's all she needed. Just 1 lucky shot. She got it. Andy flashed his beam. For a split second, the beam reflected off an armoured breastplate, and she saw him, left arm outstretched holding the torch. She let off 5 or 6 shots in succession, well to the left of where the light had been. She heard him cry out and curse. "Got you, bastard," she thought. "You're not so smart." Andy had been hit. A shot had nicked his upper right arm. Nothing too serious, but he was bleeding. It was a timely reminder that it takes only 1 fluky shot to kill a man. B had also seen Maria in the intermittent flashes. She had seen her follow Andy and was now behind her. She had also heard Andy's cry and guessed he had taken a shot. She slipped off her shoes and, clutching the poleaxe, crept out from where she was hiding. Andy staggered into another column, glad for its protection. He flashed his beam in Maria's direction. She was 20 meters away and spun around to fire a shot to the left of the beam, but Andy glimpsed for a moment someone else behind her. B? She was alive. He moved around the column and switched on his beam again, this time for a full 2 seconds. Maria got off another 3 shots, and then he heard her gun click. She was out of shots. Yet in those 2 seconds, he had clearly seen B prowling behind her with something in her hands. He turned the beam on again and trained it on Maria. She was on her haunches, rummaging in her bag, pulling out another handgun. No time to rush her. B also saw her crouching, just 3 or 4 meters away. She raised the poleaxe high, and with a demonic howl, rushed at her. Maria turned, and in the beam saw the apparition of a manic gorgon lunging at her. She fired. Lal was in a fetal position, rocking slowly in pain. In the blackness of the chapel, he had heard nothing but shouts and shots. And then he had heard B's screeching war cry. Then, nothing. He had lost a lot of blood. Waves of unconsciousness were washing over him. Soon it would all be over. From afar he heard footsteps, scuffing up the staircase, bringing light into the chapel. The footsteps crunched across the floor. He sensed a presence above him. "Doctor," said the voice. "Doctor?" It was Andy. There was then the sound of sobbing. It was Bea. She was kneeling beside him. "Lal? Lal, can you hear me?" He half opened his eyes. "Bea," he answered weakly. "Yes, it's me. Let me see where you're hurt." Andy pointed the flashlight at his leg. He was lying in a shiny pool of dark blood. "Bea, you're safe." He touched her arm. "Yes." "You're crying. Why are you crying?" It was an effort to say the words. She snuffled and swallowed. "Because I killed someone." "Yeah," said Andy, stepping into the light. "Here." Lal had only the strength to glance upwards. Dangling from his hand was Maria's head.